Hello there, and welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host, Jonah, and this lesson is going to be the first of two looking at decks, deck lists, and deck legality. Deck and deck list issues are some of the more objective calls, but they're also very impactful frequently, and consequently, when a judge gets involved, the outcome can also be similarly significant. As with the other lessons, this covers the master event document with regard to competitive tier events, particularly those with deck lists submitted. For casual tier events without deck lists, follow the policy outlined in the Level 1 master event document overview rather than this more intense stuff. As always with policy, this is an area that's being continually refined and will grow and evolve as play also continues to evolve. This does make it a bit of a challenge to both learn and teach, so this is likely a lesson that will similarly evolve over time. Let's begin by answering the question, when is a pile of cards, actually a deck for the purposes of a tournament? To start, let's go with some examples. A player shows up to a local competitive event, but they're missing a couple of cards that a friend is going to loan them. Before the event starts, they're waiting for their friend to arrive. Does it matter that they don't have the cards? Do they have an illegal deck? Should they be penalized? What about in between rounds? The player decides to check out a vendor at a large tournament and sees that they have some hyperspace treatments of a card that they haven't yet upgraded. They buy those cards, sleeve them up, add them to the deck, and then take out the originals. Did they commit a deck error? Let's make it a little bit more moderate. During a round, while sideboarding, a player removes 6 cards, doesn't add any, then begins to shuffle. At this moment in time, do they have an illegal deck and should they be penalized? The answer to all of these is no. A set of cards is just a set of cards until a player presents it for a match. A player presenting a deck is them implicitly saying, these are the cards that I intend to play for this match. Anytime before the player presents their deck, it isn't their deck for the purposes of the match, the tournament, or penalties. This policy exists because of these examples. In the first, the player has plenty of time to get the cards from their friend and add them to their deck before the event begins, or even change their deck list if they don't get the cards. For the second, the player never plays an illegal deck. They didn't even have an opponent at the time that they had excess cards in the deck. With the last example, the player might just be idly shuffling while thinking about what to bring in, or has temporarily forgotten, but remembers by the time the game begins. Having a pile of cards that isn't a deck isn't illegal. It's trying to play a game with them that creates a problem. Furthermore, in between rounds, a player may not have finished desideboarding. Maybe their match was a very close loss and they're taking time to recover. Or perhaps they wanted to go grab food before their next round and want to get in line as quickly as possible. The cards that they're carrying, while they have a strong resemblance to the deck that they're playing, don't count as their deck because they've not been presented for an ongoing match. Furthermore, a player may play games between rounds, testing different configurations of their deck. At that point, the cards are a different deck than they're playing with, but they're not a tournament object. Unless a player has presented a deck for a match, it's just a pile of cards. Well, what about the sideboard, you ask? In an ideal world, the players present their deck and sideboard at the beginning of the match and indicate that that set of cards is their sideboard. However, if a player does not do so and takes out a set of cards from their deck box, we can generally assume that the removed cards are their sideboard. If a player does not remove the sideboard from their deck box at the beginning of the match, all the cards that they can access while going into their sideboard are considered to be a part of the sideboard. This is something that we'll discuss in depth during the following lesson on deck checks, but this does mean that deck boxes that can contain 2 decks but only have 1 cover can cause issues for player. A deck box that can contain 2 decks but has separate covers for each container avoids this issue. The reason this policy exists is because during sideboarding, both players are focused primarily on their side of the table and are much less likely to be observing their opponent closely. Players do sometimes sleeve and unsleeve cards or go rooting around in their deck box for sideboard card, so those actions aren't necessarily going to raise alarm bells. This means that a player who has additional unregistered cards in their deck box has an opportunity for malicious action, and it's important to strongly disincentivize that player behavior. An exception to this policy is any promos that are distributed as part of the event are not included. Some players may show up to an event with only 1 deck box, no binder or anything else to securely hold their cards, and we want players to be able to protect their cool cards that we give them. Now, what about deck lists? Deck lists are a list of cards that a player has chosen to register for the event. They must play every round with the registered deck and sideboard, and begin each match with their deck as submitted for their main deck, with no pre-boarding allowed. A deck list should include the player's name, so that we can associate the list with the player for performing deck checks, their leader, base, main deck. Most decks will also include a sideboard, but it's not required. It's also encouraged to have players include their Star Wars Unlimited ID if you're not using a tool that links the deck list directly to a player profile, to help disambiguate players with the same name. Speaking of entities with the same name, it's important for players to clearly and unambiguously identify each card that they're playing. Registering Chewbacca doesn't clearly identify a card in Unlimited, as there are several different versions of the character. The best way to identify uniques is with their subtitle, but including set code and card number can also uniquely identify cards. In the case of potentially ambiguous card names, it is up to the head judge to determine if a card is unambiguous. For example, a player registering Lieutenant Childson as a set 4 with no subtitle has uniquely identified a card, as there is only one unit for that character. Similarly, For a Cause would be enough to identify For a Cause I Believe In. However, Timely, while it would have previously been only Timely Intervention, could now also be Timely Reinforcements, and therefore isn't unambiguous. Furthermore, deck lists aren't final until the event requires them to be submitted. If a player submits a deck list before the deadline and wants to edit their deck list, or it is discovered to be illegal, they should not be penalized and should be allowed to edit their deck list. Usually the deadline for the event is the beginning of round 1, with deck lists either submitted online in advance or paper lists collected by judges during opening announcements. Let's move on to the infractions and fixes themselves. If it is determined that a player has an illegal deck, they have too many cards, or too few cards, or their deck otherwise doesn't match their deck list, and the deck list is legal, that player will receive a game loss. It is applied to the current game end match. This can sometimes end a match. If it doesn't end the match, the player who received the loss chooses who starts with the initiative. If the players have not taken any game actions, likely because the issue is caught during a beginning of round deck check, players are not allowed to sideboard. Otherwise, they are. If the issue is caught during a game, players are allowed to sideboard. Of course, before play continues, the deck should be brought to match the deck list and become a legal deck. However, if a player calls attention to their own deck error during the game, it's the first time in the event that they've committed a deck error, and the opponent hasn't made decisions based on seeing erroneous cards, such as seeing sideboard cards while searching the deck, the penalty is downgraded to a warning instead of a game loss, and the deck is fixed before proceeding with the game. Essentially, if a player realizes that they forgot to de-sideboard, or they have an opponent's card in their deck, or something along those lines, they can call a judge and receive a warning instead of a game loss. Let's go over that criteria a little bit more thoroughly. First, the player has to call attention to it themselves. We want to incentivize and reward players for calling a judge on their own errors. Note that they don't have to be the one who raises their hand and calls for a judge. They need to have been the one to bring it up. If their opponent realizes the problem but the player calls a judge on themselves, the player wasn't the one who called attention to it. Their opponent caught them. Second, this only applies the first time in a tournament when a player commits this error. We want to allow some grace to players to make mistakes. Forgetting to de-sideboard is a very common error, but on the flip side, pre-boarding can grant a very significant advantage, and so we don't want to allow players to do this infinitely. Third, the opponent can't have potentially made decisions based on the erroneous cards. If the opponent has resolved an ability that lets them look at cards in their opponent's deck and has potentially seen the card in question, they may have made decisions based on that incorrect information, and that's not something that we can change, and so the game has been impacted in a way that we can't repair. If we meet those criteria, which is relatively easy to do, then we can begin to fix the issue. First, we have the player check their sideboard. Players are allowed to look at their sideboard at any point in time, and checking the 10-ish card sideboard will be faster than checking the entire deck and will help us determine the extent of the issue. If necessary, we can also quickly count the deck and add all the cards that the player has access to check deck size legality. If you or the player aren't certain that all of the issues have been identified after looking at the sideboard, you can also inspect the main deck, but that can get a little bit complicated maintaining card order, because some cards are known and other cards aren't, and you want to make sure that that stays proper. You want to identify whether or not the deck has too many cards, too few cards, or simply the wrong cards in it. Once you've made that determination, remove the incorrect cards, add the correct cards, and shuffle the deck, ensuring that the random portion of the deck is preserved, but re-randomized within its section. For example, if 8 cards were placed on the bottom of the deck for U-Wing reinforcement, those cards should be shuffled and replaced on the bottom of the deck so that the player doesn't know which order those 8 cards are in. If the player is confident that none of those cards are erroneous, we can just leave them unexamined at the bottom of the deck and skip that shuffle step. If one or more of the erroneous cards were in the player's hand when the issue is discovered, the player will draw a card from their deck to replace it to ensure that they have a legal number of cards in their deck and hand. And all the cards are legal cards to have in their deck and hand at that point in time. Once the deck and hand have been restored to a legal state, the game can continue and the player receives a warning. Sometimes, a player will submit an illegal deck list. They'll include too few cards in their main deck, too many in their sideboard, potentially include suspended cards, or maybe just include cards that aren't unambiguous. In this case, the deck list is edited to match the player's deck, and they are issued a game loss. This issue can be discovered at any point after the deck list submission deadline, including in between rounds. If the issue is discovered during a round, the game loss is applied to that round. If the issue is discovered between rounds, the game loss is issued at the start of the next round. Decklist issues are relatively straightforward because they're most frequently just clerical errors, and with digital decklist entry tools, there's often some amount of legality checking to ensure that a player's decklist is legal for the format it is being registered in, because that can be objectively and automatically verified. This is just the start, though. Our next lesson will be a high-level overview of deck checks and handling marked cards, some practical examples and ideas to carry with you in the scenarios where you'll most likely be encountering the infractions we just discussed. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/swoo_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they're released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community in discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.